people are taking in a lot of data from all kinds of stimuli. And, if you're not really fully connected to yourself and all these different parts and all these different feelings, and if you don't know how to navigate that territory, then you don't know how to process these experiences that you go through. And we're constantly going through experiences, not that it's always rocking us, but we're always having experiences, and every experience has some kind of impact. And
Yeah.
then if we're not kind of processing them, digesting them, metabolizing them sufficiently, then it starts to add up. And, it's not unusual for those things to start coming out in mind body symptoms.
Welcome to How to Trust Yourself, the podcast for anyone who's done with the endless second guessing and ready to tune in to your inner guidance. I'm Anna Holtzman, and I get that feeling of trudging through life like you're wading through mud, trying to figure out which way to go. In my 20s, I spent more time asking what should I do with my life than writing about crushes or bad dates in my journal. I've tried on a lot of answers: architecture, publishing, editing reality TV for a decade, and finally landing on therapy and coaching, helping people like you connect with your purpose. But here's the thing I've learned through all those twists and turns. Trusting yourself is the key to moving forward, even when the path feels messy. So if you're ready to stop doubting yourself and start listening to your gut, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. In today's episode, I'm talking with Dr. Jennifer Franklin, one of the first gastropsychologists in the U.S. Dr. Franklin specializes in treating neuroplastic symptoms and disorders of gut-brain interaction like irritable bowel syndrome and cyclic vomiting syndrome. Drawing from her own recovery journey, she's spent over 2 decades helping others heal through experimental, mindfulness-based, and somatic approaches. Dr. Franklin is also a teacher, speaker, and content creator, sharing her expertise on the brain-gut connection and how to foster lasting healing. You're going to get so much out of this conversation. Let's get started. Jennifer, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to get to know you a little bit better and learn more about what you do. Thanks for being here.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
And just to start this conversation off, I'd love to have you share with the listeners what you do and who you help.
Well, I am a psychologist, and I've been working for now over 20 years with patients who have what are called disorders of gut-brain interaction. This is a category of gastrointestinal problems that includes irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS, cyclic vomiting syndrome, which is also referred to as CVS, chronic constipation, and a few other conditions which are not attributable to disease or organic dysfunction. And then, all along, as I've been working with those types of patients, I've also been referred other types of patients, you know, chronic pain of various kinds, pretty much anything. I've seen heart arrhythmias that have no, medical basis. I've seen weird eye twitches. I mean, I've seen a whole gamut of symptoms and conditions over the years, but GI is what I'm really, that's my niche specialty.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. You're just sharing the basics of what you do, but even in that, there are some themes that are popping out to me that I'll bring into the conversation as we go along. And I guess I'll just say it instead of leaving that hanging.
Okay.
You know, I've had some folks come to me with to check out if we'd be good to work together, who mentioned this one particular symptom, cyclic vomiting syndrome.
Huh.
And it happens to be one that I personally don't have experience with, really don't know anything about. And I remember that the first time I got an email from someone saying they were curious about working with me and they experienced cyclic vomiting syndrome. I remember the fear response that I had to reading that, like, oh my gosh, my nervous system was like, that sounds like an out of control thing, and I'm not familiar with it. Um, and so, the client's coming in with a lot of fear, and a lot of what they're looking for is someone who is not freaked out by the thing that's bringing up so much fear for them.
Yeah.
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 So
Okay. I'm not.
with that in mind,
Mhm.
um, so much of this work is work that many of us are led to through our own transformational experiences, our own challenges. I know all the stuff that I work with clients on is stuff that I've struggled with. There is some version of it. And I'm curious if there was a personal pivotal experience for you that led you to this work. And if so, would you share about it?
Definitely. I'm open about the fact that I was diagnosed with IBS as a teenager because, particularly when working with patients who have GI symptoms, if you think about it, digestive issues relate to poop and vomiting and things that are really unpleasant for people to hear about. And so it's sort of taboo. I think talking about poop is more taboo than almost anything
Oh,
else.
totally.
I think today people talk
Totally.
more openly about religion and sex and poop. No. so, um, so I, started being open about the fact that I was diagnosed with IBS as a teenager, from the very beginning of my career, because I just knew that that was going to be something that would help people to want to talk to somebody about it, and
Yeah.
and that they would feel safer with me knowing that I had experienced it
And you
myself.
weren't afraid to say the words to describe it.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So I had a really interesting experience in that. So I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I started having these digestive problems, and my mother brought me to a pediatric. I don't even know. I guess he was a pediatric gastroenterologist. Um, and I didn't realize this, but he was really progressive minded, and so
Mm.
he they did a couple of what did they do? They didn't do endoscopies back then, or they didn't do one on me, but I had I think it was the swallow test. I did some kind of testing, and um, and right away the gastroenterologist that he was diagnosing me with IBS, and very quickly, I think it was that first appointment when he confirmed the diagnosis, he said, "There's really not much more I can do for you."
Wow.
Given me a stomach relaxant that I would take when I needed to, but sometimes it helped and sometimes it didn't, and maybe part of it
Yeah.
was a placebo. But anyway, I kept having horrible symptoms. But what he told me when he diagnosed me is, "I can't really do anything else to help you, but uh, I would like to refer you to my colleague, and I think my colleague would be able to help you." And
Oh,
his
wow.
colleague was a psychologist.
Wow. And
So yeah,
I just want to pause if it's okay to say, you mentioned that in hindsight, this doctor was pretty progressive. And yeah, I would agree with that because traditionally doctors are trained to say, well, I have all the answers. And if you know, there is nothing more for you if I don't have anything more for you. So that's so
yeah,
cool that he
yeah,
was open to that.
yeah. He was really progressive. He understood mind body symptoms and
Yeah.
how to address them effectively. So right there, that was really huge. And of course, I sat on the referral, and my symptoms got worse and worse and worse. And I was missing a lot of school. I was losing a lot of weight. Although I
Mm.
was teeny to begin with, but I really was emaciated. And I'd say, from the time he gave me the referral until I actually reached out to the psychologist. It took me a year. Then I reached
Yeah.
out to the psychologist and I started seeing that person.
And by the way, it may be worth asking because I think that's extremely common. Why was it? Logically, one might ask, why was it that you waited a year?
Well, I waited a year because I just was really uncomfortable. I was just really uncomfortable reaching out to a psychologist because of what it would say about me.
Yeah.
And so, just the stigma.
Yeah.
Um, and
Which
I
holds so
waited,
many people back.
yeah, and we're
Yeah.
talking, many years ago now. um, I waited a year and I waited until I was absolutely desperate for help and I had nowhere else to turn. Like at that time, I don't think they were prescribing a lot of different medications to children. And so there was really no other option. It was kind of good that I had no other option because
Mm,
this was the only thing available that was recommended. And
yeah.
it made it really clear what to do. So I reached out and started seeing this psychologist once a week. And I never, I never talked about my symptoms ever.
Mm,
I would just talk about my life. It was, a psychoanalyst actually, and not that I knew what that was back then, but I would just go and talk, and I felt really seen and really heard and really cared for. And I felt
mm,
that way by my gastroenterologist from the get-go. I only had a
yeah.
few appointments with him, but I felt really seen and heard and cared for. And so after a year of working with the psychologist and never talking about my symptoms, just talking about my life, all of the acute symptomatology went away.
Mm,
And if anything, my life got more stressful during that year. So just
yeah.
talking to somebody made my symptoms, I think, I estimate it got about 50% better. So
Yeah.
with the acute symptomatology gone, I was able to go back to my life as normal. Everything was pretty normal. I still had ongoing symptoms, but they were a lot more manageable and low level, and it didn't interfere with my life. So that was amazing. And so by the
Mm,
time I graduated high school, um, I realized that there was a very strong relationship between the mind and body. And that was undeniable. And that was the only explanation for the improvement I'd experienced. And
yeah.
so, you know, I ended up going to graduate school for psychology. I wanted to become a psychologist myself. Eh, Not really because of that, but other things happened. And I think I was just led towards that work anyway. But in deciding what graduate program I wanted to go to, I really had difficulty finding a program at that time. This is 1997 when I was applying. I had a lot of difficulty finding a program that was going to talk about the mind body relationship. And so I ended
Yeah.
up at a really small school that was going to talk about that was going to include the body in the study of psychology. And so that's where I ended up going. And then
Mm,
as a function of going there, I learned a lot more of what I needed to understand. One, in order to completely recover, which I wasn't even trying to do. And
yeah.
then, because I didn't think it was possible.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it happened without my really trying to make it happen. I had just accepted that I was going to
Yeah.
live with IBS for the rest of my life. But then I was learning all these things and I was tinkering with them. And then it was more than that. It was a lot of different things. But I ended up recovering in graduate school. And
Yeah.
that's when I realized I really needed to work with people who have these kinds of symptoms.
This is an incredible story, Jennifer. Thank you so much for sharing this story with us. And these stories that we have, they're not just words and they're not just narrative. And I just want to share like a little snippet of the physiological experience I've been having while I'm listening to you. Um, you were describing the acute stage of your
Mhm.
symptoms and using words like emaciated. I noticed, my body like tense up hearing that. Sounds like a really scary word. Just this sense of emergency. And then also like waiting the full year to see the psychologist. And you said I had no choice left, and I had this sense of feeling backed into a corner. And again, my body was like tensed up. And then when you said, and I wrote this down, I felt seen and heard and cared for. I just felt like this shiver go down my spine and this sense of like just a sigh
Mhm.
being let out, and could feel my shoulders softening. It, our nervous systems are so like responsive even
Mhm.
to a story that, this is your lived experience, not mine, but I sort of got a mini version of getting to live through that in my body along with you. So thank you
Mhm.
so much for taking us on that journey.
Welcome. You're welcome. I hope it's helpful to your listeners to hear, my story and just to know that it's really possible to recover from something like irritable bowel syndrome. 'Cause I didn't know that.
And that feeling seen and heard and cared for could have such an impact on your physiology, on your physical experience.
It does. I mean,
Yeah.
I talk about emotional nourishment. We take in food, we ingest food as nourishment for the body, but we don't necessarily think about their other forms of nourishment.
Yeah.
But we do need other forms of nourishment besides just food.
We clearly do, even though we were mostly raised to think that that stuff doesn't matter
Yeah.
or that you
I
can't get it.
I know.
Yeah.
As a culture,
Yeah.
we continue to devalue it in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
We do.
Um, so w I'm curious to get a little bit into the nitty-gritty of, like, and then your story kind of culminated with that you recovered in grad school, and I got chills again. It's like, wow, how incredible that that's actually possible.
Mhm.
Um, and you said you recovered without trying. Looking back,
Mhm.
and I know that you help others recover now too. So, and I know you're not telling them like, "Oh, just don't think about it," right? There are like probably frameworks and tools that you've drawn from your own experience and your further explorations. What are some of those specific like tools, techniques, frameworks that you find particularly helpful with gut brain issues?
Um, I mean, honestly, I think one of the biggest things is what we've already talked about. Is just um, fundamentally, as a patient, being on the other end of a provider or somebody who's tasked with caregiving, or trying to help you, um, it's important for that person to be authentic and real and warm and kind and compassionate and caring. And I think that is the number one thing that is the most important, in our care and healing and recovery from a disorder of gut brain interaction. And I don't think we usually think of it that way, but that is the most important piece. Because when you have that kind of relationship, that sigh of relief, that easing that you described in your own body, Anna, is what we all feel when we're hurting and when we don't know what to do and we don't know who we can trust, and we just desperately need some relief, and to just have somebody sincerely want to be there for us and not tell us it's in our head, and not assume anything about us or not make false promises. I think there's a lot of false promises that go on. Oh yeah, I can help you, or this can help, or this is the
Yeah.
miracle thing. This helps, this can help so many people, or this has helped so many people. Just all of these like quick fix type things that are so well marketed, right? And that we can find so easily for the gut in particular, like lots of supplements and things like that. And so I think just being on the other end of somebody who just really wants to be with a person throughout this journey, through the ups and downs, and just figure it out together so that they're not, a collaborative approach has been shown in the research to be one of the most helpful aspects of treatment. And they're usually referring to physicians, but I think there's a lot of people that it could really be. And if it's your physician and then other people in your life, then you have a whole tribe, right? And that's how we develop healthy minds and bodies, right? We are hopefully we are born and raised into a family system, and then we have other relatives, and we have friends, and we have a whole tribe of people that that are helping to raise us, a little village. It takes a village to raise us, and I think it also takes somewhat of a village to help us recover. And so I think that's number one. And I think there's a lot of different things that can help. One of the things that I really pride myself on is taking an individualized approach to treatment with patients, because everybody needs something a little bit different. And there are some commonalities, right? I think, for some people, it's a little bit more about settling the mind and working with a high level of anxiety, often lifelong anxiety that was never diagnosed, never acknowledged, never identified because it was always there. And when you were raised in an anxious family system, then everybody's anxious to some degree. So it's hard to even recognize it. It's like you got to take a fish out of water before you can finally see what's really going on. And so I think that's, just calming, settling the nervous system is a big piece of it. And for some people, that means, not working relationally, but actually finding more time to themselves. So some people really need a little more time to themselves to settle their nervous system because they're around people all the time and it's just too much for them. So it can be more individualized in that way. And other people they're dealing with too much isolation and they need a little more contact, or maybe they need a different contact with people than they're getting. They might need more touch. They might need more intimacy, more emotional intimacy. And underneath all of that, I think is, some degree of chronic stress, which often relates to a traumatic experience, or not just one experience, but kind of an ongoing experience of trauma. And that experience can be really hard to identify.
Thank you so much for describing that in such a relatable way, a beautiful and tangible way. I mean, I so resonated with what you just shared.
Mm.
And I like just I had kind of like a light bulb go off as you were sharing this, that the first thing you said is like, just for the practitioner to be authentic, kind, and caring. And it's
Mhm.
like, well, I mean, that's so simple, right? So
Not really. It's not actually
it's not.
simple.
Exactly. It's not simple. And I'm curious about your reflection on why this isn't simple. What came up for me was, like, in order to be kind, what is it? I'm reading from the page. Authentic, kind, and caring. I wrote down what you said. Um, you've really got to trust yourself and trust that you are enough. And
Mhm.
I know that um it's not really the messaging that I got in my education for the
Mhm.
most part. And a memory that came to me was right at the end of my graduate school experience. I got a degree in mental health counseling. My advisor was asking, so what do you see yourself doing, and what
Mhm.
do you want to specialize in, or whatever? And I talked about what I was feeling and who I wanted to work with, and how I saw myself helping people. And she
Mhm.
was like, "Well, that's great, but I think you should, as a backup, you should study an operationalized approach to CBT that you can do, like this cookie cutter same thing that's been clinically approved and da da da." And it's
Mhm.
so the opposite of just trusting yourself and trusting that the love and authenticity you have are enough. Um, so to my mind, there's the certain indoctrination that pulls us away from self-trust. And I'm curious what your take is on, like, why is that? So why is that not so simple to just offer authentic, kind, and caring care?
I think I can't speak for everyone, but I think it's hard to be an authentic human being in our society. I think there's just a lot of messaging that we get, um, not just from advertising and social media, but from family and friends, that it's not okay to have the feelings that we have, or it's not okay to say that, or it's not okay to express something. And in whether it's verbally or non-verbally, don't you know don't fidget, don't it's like we just get all kinds of messaging that tells us that we just can't be who we are in many moments. And so we start um, censoring ourselves. I mean, you just see this with little kids, right? Little kids say the darndest things because they haven't gotten that messaging in their bones yet. They haven't like
Yeah.
really understood that they can't do those things because there are consequences. And so, I mean, yeah, we don't want to just walk around and say whatever and hurt people's feelings, and not think at all about the impact we're making on others with our words and actions. But we also can't go to the other extreme, or, I think it's easy to go to the other extreme of being overly constructed, and censoring ourselves and shutting parts of ourselves down because it isn't okay um, to be authentic.
Given all of that, I'd love to hear a little bit about your experience of, like, how did you develop and build a practice
Huh,
as a psychologist,
huh,
following your gut on all of the well, and gut is your thing, but
yeah,
following your gut on all
yeah,
this stuff, because
yeah,
it really goes against the norms, it goes against a lot of our teaching.
yeah,
You
yeah,
mentioned that you're very open with your own experience of being diagnosed with IBS as a teen, and that really flies in the face of
yeah,
the idea that psychologists are taught to, really minimize self-disclosure.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's definitely been a process. Uh, you know, I oof, I don't even know where to begin with this, but I think um, I've just since I was really little, I've always had a sense of what feels authentic for me. Like I just knew I just was really connected to my gut always. And so for me, it wasn't a matter of like finding that I hadn't been shut down to that extent. So, because of my upbringing, and I think, you know, there are good parts to what I'm saying, and there's kind of a benefit and a cost to every way of being in the world. And I think for me, just from the get go, I just wasn't gonna let anybody shut me down. And so I was connected to my gut, and I was able to. I was able to at least know what felt right and true for me, whether I did that or not. That was sometimes an act of courage, right? So, like,
Yeah.
for me, choosing the graduate program that I went to, even though it was very unconventional, it wasn't a major, university psychology program, but I just couldn't get myself. It was like sometimes I was at these points where I would have had to shut myself down, and
Yeah.
I just was never willing to shut myself down to that extent that I wasn't living according to my own sense of truth, right? Like,
Yeah.
felt like I would, like, there was no integrity in that for me. I just couldn't even fathom doing it. It just seemed like a non-choice for me. So,
Yes.
I knew that when I visited this graduate school, I knew that I had to be there. I knew that they were going to teach me things that I wanted to know. And no, there was nobody else that was going to offer as an accredited a program and include the body at that time. Like, UCLA, USC, like all these schools that were in Los Angeles, like that I just couldn't do it. I couldn't get myself to even apply.
Yeah.
And so then I ended up, at this institution, and yeah, I don't know, just it wasn't that hard for me to follow my gut in a lot of senses. But then when it came to other things, like for instance, I bought the URL for my specialty website, which is don'thateyourguts.com. I bought that 10 years before I ever developed the website because
I remember you telling me that.
yeah,
Yeah.
because I didn't feel confident. Like, I didn't trust so I trusted myself. It's just I was worried about the reaction it was going to get. So it's like I wasn't really living authentically because I was scared, right? I was scared of the
Yeah.
backlash. I was scared I was going to, I was already coming out of a graduate program that was unconventional. I didn't want to be written off. I was trying to get in with a bunch of physicians and get their referrals and get their respect and build credibility as a young, you know, new psychotherapist. And then, when I became licensed, I was, just trying to get referrals and build my practice. And so I just didn't want to take the risk of, like, I don't know, going too against the grain.
Yeah. There's so much that I relate to in what you're describing, and thank you so much,
Mhm.
for being open about this. Um,
But
there's so
I
much
have
I
to say
yeah.
it sucks because I have regrets. It's like
Mm,
I wished I would have had more courage to just
mm,
come out and say what I thought then, because I was right. A lot of things. I knew things that other people weren't
yeah,
talking about. I was way ahead of the curve. And I just was really scared of coming out and being like a John Sarno type figure, where, not that I had that kind of notoriety, but I didn't want to deal with that kind of fallout for
yeah.
taking the risk and saying things that were so not like consistent with mainstream treatment for disorders of gut brain interaction.
And for any listener who doesn't know who John Sarno is, Dr. John Sarno was a physician working in the mainstream who brought the notion of mind-body connection into the mainstream, and the mainstream promptly said, "We're not interested, and we're not going to refer any patients to you." Um, but you know what? I'll share what I related to, and my interpretation of it for myself is that like, I'm a person who has gone down unconventional paths. And one of those paths is that I've gone down many paths. I've not stuck to one career path. I've made like really big pivots from like architecture to publishing to working in reality TV to becoming a therapist, and the type of things where people are like, "What? How'd you get from that to there?" Um, but I see myself as someone who feels both fear and that passion to follow my gut, both of those things intensely.
Mhm.
And I think without that intensity, I wouldn't deviate from a more conventional path. I wouldn't have followed my gut at all. And with that intensity comes really intense fears that have felt like they've really slowed me down along the way. But I
Mhm.
sort of see them both as part of the same.
Mhm.
Um, and, it gets like, I think it's so interesting that we're talking about you having this really strong connection to your gut, and then also your gut being the place in your body where you experienced uh, the most
Mhm.
intense barrier or stuckness, or however you would describe it.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, yeah, um, I think when we don't listen to our guts, when we don't quite understand what the gut's trying to tell us, we can suffer. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes that's what happens with the patients that I'm working with is that sometimes there really is some kind of emotional or psychological thing going on in their lives or that happened in the past that's not really been fully processed, digested, and metabolized that um, it 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 just does a number on the body. And I think a lot of the people I've worked with are far more sensitive than they recognize. And that was me too.
Mm,
I knew that I was sensitive in certain ways, but I didn't realize I was sensitive in other ways. And
yeah.
and I and it's not usually a good thing to be sensitive. When people say, "Oh, you're so sensitive," or "you're too sensitive," it's not usually a compliment. And
It's
so,
not perceived as a good thing culturally.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. And so it's something that I think we try to cover up and we try to deflect from, and we try to put on armor and be tough and not be we try to fight against
Yeah.
whatever that is that people are speaking to. And um and I think it's just really hard to be a sensitive person, and we're all sensitive. I mean, we're all wired for sensitivity. It's
Yeah.
just that some of us are truly highly sensitive individuals, and other people, I just don't think quite experience the world with that level of acuity and intensity. Um, it's funny, actually. I know that that's true. I have a friend of mine who's who's also in the world of psychotherapy, works in the world of psychotherapy, and he recently had an experience where he started having more sensitivity. And he's like, "Is that what it's like for you?" And he told me
Mm,
about this very specific experience he had, and I said, "Yes, that's exactly what it
wow.
might sound like." He's like, "Wow, wow, that's really intense." And I said, "Yeah, it is.
Ugh,
It is." But and I don't think that I think there's a lot of people walking around not realizing that they're highly sensitive because it's really hard to identify. Um,
and there's the stigma, as you said.
there's a stigma. Yeah, it's hard to identify because if you're trying to suppress that, not
Right.
consciously, but if you're, or maybe consciously too, but if you're trying to kind of keep that at bay and to kind of hide it, and you're not sure how to manage it, and you're in a family that's not really recognizing it, or they're none of them are highly sensitive like you are, or all of them are highly sensitive. I mean, either way, it's like hard to get a hand on what's actually happening
Yeah.
and to be authentic.
Yeah.
And so I think that people are taking in a lot of data from all kinds of stimuli, all kinds, and not, if you're not really fully connected to yourself and all these different parts and all these different feelings, and if you don't know how to navigate that territory, then you don't know how to process these experiences that you go through. And we're constantly going through experiences, not that it's always rocking us or always having an intense impact on us, but we're always having experiences, and every experience has some kind of impact. And
Yeah.
then if we're not kind of processing them, digesting them, metabolizing them sufficiently, or we're not even doing that process at all, right? Because we just don't even pay attention to, we don't think that we're needing to pay attention to it, or it's just buried under layers of defenses.
Mm.
Then, it starts to add up, and it's not, it's not unusual for those things to start coming out in mind body symptoms, and the gut is just one of those places where I think it's, there's some genetics to it. There's some, um, I don't know, maybe one day we'll have a handle on why it's the gut and not some other part of the body. But a lot of people with
Mm.
gut problems also have other forms of chronic pain as well, or other mind body conditions that have been diagnosed. So, but anyway, I do think that there is something about just not recognizing, um, emotional and psychological impact of different things in our lives that ends up affecting the gut, perhaps more than other parts of the body.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it could be very similar.
I want to kind of like leapfrog back a little bit to what you started with, that story about the friend of yours who, maybe does not have a particularly sensitive system, but then had an experience of
Yeah.
sensitivity and was like, whoa, is that what you, I was like, oh my gosh, that really hit me because, I think I'm someone who just like experiences emotions very intensely, and I tend to be drawn toward friendships with other people who also do, and we'll have these conversations of like,
Mhm.
I don't know that everyone else understands that I feel like
Mhm.
I feel crazy sometimes, and it's like it's so intense, and I just can't even believe that I can move through this wave of
Mhm.
intense feeling. And um and I also related to that, like, we don't always recognize that we're sensitive. I think I did spend a fair portion of my life using avoidance and numbing to, or, when things got too uncomfortable, I would just like, pivot. I'm not going to do this anymore because it just feels too intense.
Right.
Um, I'm curious if you see your sensitivity as an impediment or a fuel or both to your development as a person, as a professional, um, as someone who is on a path of following your authentic
Mhm.
pull.
Mhm. Um, I think I would I would imagine for just about everyone, it's a blessing and a curse to be a highly sensitive person.
Yeah.
Um, for me, given the work that I do, it's been more of a blessing than a curse. I think it really helps me, in my work with people, but at times it can be, um, at certain moments it can be difficult, to hear about a horrific experience somebody has been through. Um, I'm just right there in it with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but I think that happens when you just open yourself up empathically, whether you're highly sensitive or not. But it just might be that much more intense. I don't know. I don't know what it's like to not be me. So, um, but I think it's always a blessing and a curse. It's a curse to be that sensitive. Like there are certain environments that I don't want to be in, because it's just too much for me. Uh,
Yeah.
and so I just don't get to experience those things, or, either I avoid them, or I do them, but it's just really unpleasant. And even just the build up to them, I'm just kind of like dreading it. And
I'm
um,
thinking of the conference you and I met at because I found that environment highly overstimulated.
oh, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah. But crowds in general, crowds,
Yeah. Yeah.
they're really, really tough. And so then I don't really go to concerts and festivals and those kinds of things, and I miss out on all of those types. I mean, not all of them, but I miss out on a lot of those types of experiences. And I just, I just can't get myself to do it because it's just too much. It ends up, I, yeah. So
Hearing you,
anyway,
yeah, hearing you say that, it also like reminded me of how I met my husband, which was I was doing online dating and like trying to make myself seem pleasing to people. And then I realized, no, I'm never going to find the right person for me if I keep doing that. So I
right.
just wrote a really authentic thing and it ended with, I'm allergic to loud crowds and extreme sports.
Yeah. And it worked.
And it worked. And I met the most perfectly matched weirdo for my weirdness. Yeah.
That's awesome. Awesome. But it's so interesting to hear you say like that like it wasn't your go-to to just be authentic and say
No.
who you authentically were to be able to find. I mean, that's what we do.
Hmm.
Yeah. Whether you're sensitive or not, whether you're highly sensitive or not highly sensitive, I think that is that is what we do and why it's hard to be an authentic person in this society.
And it's with that authenticity when when we're able to dip into it, that's where the magic happens.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, as we're winding down soon to the conclusion of this conversation, which I honestly could have all day if if time weren't an issue. Um, if there were a soapbox message that you are personally passionate about spreading through the work that you do, what might that be?
Well, I think this might be sort of an extension of other answers I've given you in this conversation. But for as long as I've been a psychologist, I've been saying that healing from a disorder of gut brain interaction is relational.
Yeah.
So that's really my message is that healing is relational. Our symptoms arise within the context of our lives. And we are relational as human beings. We don't survive without an early attachment relationship. We don't function well at all in isolation. We need relationships, right? When we get sick, when our tummies hurt, um, we need relationships to help us feel better, to soothe us. So we need good relationships with our physicians and providers. We need supportive relationships with friends and family, with someone who's willing to be there for us. We learn who we are and how to care for ourselves or not take very good care of ourselves in our relationships with other people, right? Especially our caregivers. And how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to our feelings, our thoughts, our beliefs, our hopes, our dreams, our needs are also heavily shaped by our relationships, right? Trauma is largely a function of relational trauma, right? Some of the most traumatic events we have are a function of relational trauma, the things that other people are saying and doing that cause us to be impacted, uh, you know, severely and adversely. The correction for relational trauma is first and foremost a safe enough relationship so that a person can start healing and recovering from the traumatic experience or experiences, right? So, our relationships with ourselves, with other people, with our environments, and with all of the different stimuli around us all the time affect us. So, if maladaptive relational dynamics are at the root of our suffering, then changing these dynamics is the fix. Ergo, healing is fundamentally relational. We see this again and again in a lot of the research literature on empathy, on self compassion, on how important it is to have a good relationship with your physician, or even the 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 research showing that people who are married live longer than people who are not.
Mm.
Yeah. So healing is fundamentally relational, particularly when you have a disorder of gut brain interaction. That's my soapbox message.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I had a realization as I was listening to you, which is this is why I do this podcast, because it's an opportunity to be in relationship with people who are also on a path of discovering and following their authentic pull in life. And I mean, I just so appreciate getting to have this conversation with you and connect relationally. I am growing from just having this conversation.
I love
Um,
hearing
yeah, and
that.
thank you. For for those who might be listening to the podcast and they're very early on in a journey of um, gathering up the courage to follow their authenticity. Maybe they're on a journey with gut brain issues and they're very early on. They've heard stuff that you've shared. It's given them some hope, but they also feel completely overwhelmed about where to start, how to start. What words of encouragement would you give that person?
Something we're talking about very explicitly. Just listen to your gut. If you don't know what your gut is saying, then slow down. Maybe work on just bringing more mindfulness into your life, just slowing down, connecting with yourself. If you struggle to connect, if you struggle to slow down and connect with what's happening inside your own self because you feel so uncomfortable physically, or there's pain, like physical, chronic physical pain, whether it's abdominal or not, um, then slow down while you focus on something that feels good inside, right? And learn to slow down because you're focusing on something that feels good. And if you don't know how to focus on something that feels good, then work on that. But little by little, you've got to get closer to yourself. When I say healing is relational, I'm also talking about relating to ourselves, getting connected to our own selves and all of the parts, particularly the parts that we don't listen to or that we shut out or we don't want to listen to, or we can't listen to because it's so, so disconnected from us. And that tells you something about um, what you've been through. Um, so we have to be willing to slow down and connect with ourselves and listen to the gut, right? Which means, um, you know, that is part of trusting ourselves, right? In terms of answering that question, I think this comes up because when we listen to our gut, we're talking about listening to our intuition. It's like it's not our thinking, right? It's not what we feel emotionally. That's not what listening to the gut is about, really. It's about listening to that deep voice of truth for you, whatever your truth is. It's like getting so connected to what your nervous system, what your brain knows deep within. It's not even so crystal clear, right? And that then makes it a lot easier to be authentic in the world, right? That knowing of what your truth is and what you need to do and who you are, and to listen to that, even if you don't want to listen to that, and to get support in listening to that when it feels scary to listen to that, when it feels scary to express yourself authentically. And maybe you need to work on finding ways to express yourself in ways that other people can tolerate hearing, or they can hear the messaging underneath maybe hurt or anger.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I love that it's just about slowing down and that the rest is not prescriptive. It's about looking inside for the guidance, which is very much my jam as well.
Yeah, but I think that's hard to do
It is.
by ourselves on our
It
own.
is. Absolutely.
Sometimes looking within also requires looking outside of ourselves to make sure that we have somebody there listening and witnessing, and that presence of somebody else is what enables us to look within ourselves.
Absolutely. That we're not
That's
going to
relational.
lose we're not going to lose connection by connecting with ourselves. We're not going to lose connection with others. And I think that's a great lead in to my final question, which is where can people find you? And if they reach out to you, what sorts of support and connection can they reach out to you for?
Mhm. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, and I'll say a little bit more about it as well. My website is don'thateyourguts.com. There on the website, I'm really bad about uh, posting blogs, and I'm really bad about posting on social media. So I really haven't posted anything in a long time. And maybe I'll get back to it eventually. But you can find me on social media. You can find me on Instagram and um, and Facebook at Don't Hate Your Guts. But on the website is really where, most of the materials I have for people are. I have a bunch of blog posts and pithier than that. Well, actually, I should back up. These days, if you go to my website, you can download a free ebook, which
Nice.
is basically 40 pages of easy breezy reading material that covers a lot of ground and introduces people to the way I think about treatment for disorders of gut brain interaction, and it sort of outlines my approach and gives people at the end some basic steps they can take to start healing and recovering from irritable bowel syndrome and those other things I name. And if somebody wants more, I have two in-depth courses. One is called the Brain Gut Connection course, and it's offered as a a webinar or an audio series. The webinar includes polyvagal theory. The audio series does not. That is the only difference. So there's two differences. One is a webinar with polyvagal theory. The other is an audio without polyvagal theory. Otherwise, exact same material. It's a 5-part course. And then after that, people can take a course called the Healing Audio course. It's just audio. It's 3 parts, and it kind of maps out the psychotherapeutic treatment process. And it's offered as, these are all the things, and you may need to work on some of these things more. You may need to work on some of these things less, and you can work with a psychotherapist if you're interested, and you can think about these things without, it's basically for people to take and to personalize and individualize and make work for them, given their situation and who they
Yeah.
are. Mhm.
And are you offering one-on-one or group work with folks or
Yes, I work individually with people. I also work with couples where one person has a disorder of gut brain interaction. Um, I also, sometimes work with families because I've been doing this so long that sometimes people beg me to work with their child who's suffering.
yeah.
Um, but I don't really work one-on-one with kids. I tend to work with their parents more than the
Got
kids.
it.
But yes, I do, and I have had a waiting list for a long time. So what I started doing is offering consultations. So um, if somebody is interested in working with me and I don't have openings, I always keep some appointment times available for consultation, and then we can figure out a plan. And if I have to refer them to a psychotherapist in another state um, or in the states I'm licensed in, I can do that.
Great. Well, I'll put all your info into the show notes so folks can find you for all of these various resources and to connect with you. And Jennifer, thank you so much for your openness, for your time, for being here and having this conversation together, sharing it with this audience of listeners. I so appreciate it. And I'm so glad to have connected with you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here and getting to have this conversation. I think we covered a lot of really interesting topics, and I hope your listeners are enjoying this podcast.
I'm sure they will. And I look forward to being in touch. If you enjoyed today's episode, please do me a favor. Hit that follow button so you don't miss a thing and leave a rating or review. It helps more people find this show, and honestly, it makes my day. And if you're looking for more ways to trust yourself and start listening to that gut instinct of yours, come hang out with me on Instagram at Anna_Holtzman. Let's keep the conversation going. Thanks so much for listening. And until next time, trust yourself. You've got this.